focus, as you all know, is on the new Scramble for Africa. And we have two speakers. To my left, Jeremy Corbyn MP, and to my right, Explo Nani Kofi, who's the director of the Colombo Centre for Citizens' Rights and Conflict Resolution, which is based in Peki, Volta region, Ghana, but has networks and links right across the world. And my name is Amapoku, and I am also a member of the Colombo network. So, because we only have an hour, we'll go straight into having the two speakers. Jeremy will speak first, followed by Explo. Then the floor will be open for you to make your contributions and ask your questions. And just to say, I would like you to try and keep contributions brief and concise so that we can encourage and have as many people from the floor speaking as possible. So if we could all give a hand to Jeremy, who's going to start off by speaking first.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to our workshop this afternoon. And I'm really pleased that in Stop Coalition we're having this session on Africa and a discussion about the new Scramble for Africa, and an organisation that I chair called Liberation is making this the theme of our annual meeting on January the 14th next year, which is going to again be the whole theme of the European Scramble for Africa. We just had a session downstairs on imperialism, and we were discussing then the brutal history of British imperialism all over the world, but we particularly drew attention to the situation in Kenya, where the Mau Mau people who were murdered in their thousands by the British during the colonial wars of the 1950s. Those that have survived have sought legal redress, and I've been working with them, and it was quite a poignant moment in the High Court in the summer when we finally reached a situation where the British government was at least being brought to account in court for what had gone on. And later on there was a very lengthy statement in Parliament by the Foreign Secretary in which he managed to say the settlement with the Mau Mau people did not constitute an apology or form a precedent for any future legal actions that might be taken, but instead they were going to give £25 million to those that had suffered losses during the colonial wars. This, frankly, is the tip of an iceberg that applies all over the globe, where British soldiers behaved in the most appalling way in Malaya and many, many other places. And I really do take my hat off to those Mau Mau families that have fought for so long to get to this point where at least their cause is being recognised. Because looking around this hall, I can see people very similar age to myself who were probably all brought up on the same narrative in the 1950s, that somehow or other the Mau Mau were some massive great evil force that was about to invade this country and kill us all in our beds, and it was only British soldiers' brave actions in running concentration camps in Kenya that was going to save us from this fate. And the more one looks into the history of this, and the brave work done by a small number of Labour MPs in Parliament at that time, particularly Tony Benn, and Tony Benn even then in the 1950s, and one or two others, particularly Fenner Brockway, in exposing this, eventually helped to bring this situation about. And so, without wanting to repeat what was done in the last session, I do urge you all to take part in all the debates and discussions next year and later the remains of this year on the commemoration of the centenary of the start of the First World War, and look at the effects of that war, both on the African people that died fighting in the Allied forces, and the way in which colonial masters were changed at the end of the First World War. For example, what is now Tanzania stopped being German East Africa and became British East Africa, ultimately to become independent. There's a whole lesson there to be learnt. There's also another lesson to be learnt, and that is going back a little bit further. And again, we raised the question of the quality of history teaching in our schools. During all my time in school, and I was actually passionately interested in history in school, even did it for A-level, had never heard of the 1884 Congress of Berlin. I learnt about that later on. I managed to get the House of Commons Library to find me the proceedings of the 1884 Congress of Berlin, and they're extremely interesting. This was where the European powers, with the US in observer status, sat around a table in Berlin and essentially carved up Africa between themselves. This was during what was called the Scramble for Africa in the latter part of the 19th century. And King Leopold got control of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, and he didn't even give it to Belgium. He said it's his personal territory. And it was the Belgian state then, in an act of enormous generosity in 1908, nationalised the Congo for itself. And the same slavery and everything else continued. So the history of Africa, of slavery, of exploitation, of partition, of division, of colonial wars, is something that needs to be better explained and more fully understood. And the massive contribution made to the wealth of the Western European companies, particularly, but to some extent the United States, from African exploitation going back 300, 400, 500 years is on a par with the wealth made in the City of London from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. And so when we talk about the movement for reparations, I think it's a serious issue and a serious movement. The wealth that was sucked out of Africa has never been put back. But it would be nice to think that the current situation in Africa and the African relations with the rest of the world were on a wholly different path. Sadly, they are not. Sadly, the minerals that have been exploited from Africa and still exploited from Africa, mainly by European and American companies, but increasingly by Chinese companies as well, are also dramatically underpriced where the African people are concerned, and dramatically overpriced when the products finally hit the markets for Western consumers. Where do the profits go? Sucked away into tax havens all around the world. Why is the world's biggest mining company based in Switzerland, a country where there's almost no mining whatsoever, any more than Belgium is one of the main manufacturers of chocolate, and a country that grows no cocoa last time I looked? And there are many, many other examples one can draw all over the world. So we have to have that understanding of that economic relationship. Now, moving on very quickly, because I'm conscious of the time, more recently we've had two factors coming in. One has been the idea, heavily promoted by Tony Blair and some of his colleagues, was that Africa was, his quotes, in quotes what he said, a basket case, and he had to sort it out as he set up a commission for Africa. It's very nice of Tony Blair to do that, because he's a very busy man, and he's so busy in all the rest of the world, he found time to set up a commission for Africa. And his solution is what? A market-based solution, where the IMF conditions of aid and advice to each national government are: 1, privatise everything that's publicly owned; 2, sell off your land to big business multinational corporations, Monsanto, etc., to buy up the often very, very fertile land and invest in it; thirdly, export food from Africa to Western Europe, the United States, and to some extent, or perhaps increasingly so, to China and Japan. Never mind that African children thrown off their land are starving as a result of this process. Never mind that we can buy early season vegetables air freighted in while people starve alongside it. African economic strategy is, with exceptions, but generally speaking, one of exploitation of mineral resources, sale of land and farming resources to feed the rest of the world, and the infrastructure is very much designed towards removal of primary products and raw materials away from Africa to the coast in order to be exploited elsewhere. That exploitation leads one into wars. Why were the French so interested in Mali? Why are they so interested in Central African Republic? Why have they kept so many dictators in power, other than to make life bearable and easy for the mineral companies to run their affairs in those countries? Why is there a civil war going on in the Congo? Why are certain militia groups funded by mineral companies? I think you all know the answers as well as I do. We need a debate, we need a discussion, We need a greater understanding of this before we're conned into yet another bombardment of Libya, yet another bombardment of Mali, yet another military activity somewhere in that continent. And I'm really pleased, and I'll conclude with this thought, that Explo is joining us today on the platform. It's very good he's here because he's had lots of personal problems, and I'm really pleased he's come. Explo and I go back a very long way to the founding of the Campaign for Non-Alignment in 1986, and he's a great friend of mine, and I'm a great admirer of his works and what he does. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, all of you. First of all, I want to say that bear with me that I'm not in the best of states of mind, that if my presentation seems to be a bit problematic, you just bear with me. Just before I arrived here, my younger brother died. A day after I arrived here, my father died. So I have to rush back to organize the burial of both of them. So if I'm a bit disorganized, you just understand that it's the state in which I find myself. We are looking today at the new Scramble for Africa. And the situation in Africa, a lot of time people talk about how we have failed states, how we have corruption and other things. What is not done is to explain how come we have this situation which is being referred to as a stage of failure, stage of corruption and all that. I will start from the bottom of the speech, which will be what we do. In fact, the Stop the War has a campaign on the Scramble for Africa. I think that, and I've seen that, not much attention is paid by people in organizing around that particular campaign, although it is one of the Stop the War campaigns on the website and it's well publicized. I would ask all of you that when we leave this meeting and you go to your communities, you go to your campuses, you go to your workplaces, just like we organize meetings on Syria, please organize meetings on the Scramble for Africa, on the situation in Africa, which is also one of the Stop the War campaigns. And we from Kilombo who are here, we have been involved with the Stop the War coalition since it was set up. We'll be able to get speakers to come to wherever you organize these meetings, to come and do presentations. So let's take that first. Then I will come to the situation in Africa. In fact, if you look at most of the places in Africa which have the flashpoints of war, the countries that they refer to, you see that the history of those countries have been such that they have been organized in a way to fail. Jeremy started talking about the Congo, and he talked about the past. And it didn't stop just with the Belgians and the atrocities which were carried, the way in which people's hands were cut if they didn't bring enough rubber and all that. But even when Congo became independent, Congo had one of the most committed and Africans, product of the First All Africa People's Conference, Patrice Lumumba. And when he took over, he was not allowed to rule that country for even a year. What happens is that when they have committed people, they are prevented from ruling, so you don't have evidence that Africans can have a good record. Then they are replaced by their own products of the Mobutus, who mismanage on their behalf and they control, and then they are used as examples of why Africa has a problem. You look at Somalia, a country with one dominant religion, one dominant language, but when the African countries were being divided, this country has a potential of being united. That one was divided between the French, the Italians, and the British. So even when there is the potential of unity, there's disintegration according to the way it is dismembered. And with the other ones, what they did was that the boundaries were arbitrarily drawn so that you have the connecting sub-nationalities of the African nation spread over the boundaries. So you have the centrifugal forces greater than the centripetal forces in the country. So you have a chaos. And this is what, let me put it, Central African Republic, which is recently in the news. In fact, Central African Republic started as Ubangi Shari, with the French distributing it to commercial concessionaries. So it was like business units, pockets of business units. And if you create a country as a pocket of business units, then you can see what will be the result sometime in history. So these are examples of the way in which the various countries were created. What we have today in the new phase is the introduction of the AFRICOM and the various military pacts. So I'm militarizing the politics. In the 80s, we fought against military regimes to reduce militarization of our politics, but there has been international militarization of our politics with the setting up of the AFRICOM. In fact, this whole thing has been a struggle for resources. Because in 2006, they had a summit of the African ministers and heads of state with the Chinese in Beijing. 2006, the preparatory ground for AFRICOM also started. So you see that even the timing shows that the present competition between China and the US, and the US together with the West over the control of our resources. And when you look at the way we Chinese are also building their roads, and we go to places like Kenya, exactly the same way with the British colonial rulers build the roads to the resources, the Chinese are also building it along that side. You see, apart from that, we look at various initiatives which have been taken by various Western parties. Tony Blair set up the African Commission when he was Prime Minister. After he left as Prime Minister, Tony Blair has now set up the African Governance Initiative, which he is saying that he's helping Africans to be able to do what has been done by the South Asian countries. And then we consider someone like Tony Blair a war criminal who sets up the African Governance Initiative for Africa after he has left the office with his war crimes. And he's currently having staff working in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, Malawi, South Sudan. And you can see that even the places he's working are the places that are all flashpoints of conflict. And so he has set up this institution to intensify the conflict and not to resolve the problem. See, when I look at the way in which the countries have been created and the way in which the past has contributed to it, what it means is that we have to reverse the structures which have been laid by the Berlin Conference. Next year marks the 130th anniversary of the Berlin Conference, and we are going to organize a conference in Africa, in a border town, so it's not inside one country, as a way of mobilizing people against the Berlin Conference and the negative effects that it's having in our continent. And so, through that, what we see as the way forward would be to be able to organize from the grassroots, not from the top, because the top structures in our continent have inherited the colonial structures and the Berlin Conference structures, which are only for the distraction and dismemberment of the sub-nations of the African nations. And so we organize from below, and so that identify that the two pillars of which external forces have controlled our continent and through which the domestic class which is in office, not actually ruling, who is office on behalf of the external forces, have been through the economic power and through the military strength. And because of that, we identify the various strategies which have gone on in our continent in the 80s against the increased militarization of politics and also against the austerity measures on the continent. And to be able to rebuild on the strength of such movements from below, network them throughout the continent and build a movement that can bring about change. Because we recognize that it is the control of state power that will be able to bring about change. The state power is used by forces on behalf of the external forces, of the external concerns, and it leads to politics which is not in the interest of the majority of our people, or the masses of our people. So through mobilize the masses of our people, on the basis of movements which fought but were defeated in the 80s, in almost every African country, during the 80s, after the collapse of the Eastern Europe, there were forces which were fighting to ensure that what has become the neoliberal politics of today were not, is not what should be used in directing affairs on the continent. But these forces lost, in most cases, to the forces which have come to intensify the politics of militarization and neoliberal politics. And so we are building on the basis of those movements throughout, and in solidarity and in joint work with external forces which are also for social justice. And that is why we are here in this conference. So we will be able to change the situation. The world we live in has not always been like this. It's been shaped by men and women before us. And the task to change it, the ability to change it, is the task of you and I, and it can be done.
Time is brief. We've got about 25 minutes before we have to wrap up for the next session. So what I'll ask for is, what I'll do is take 2 or 3 points or questions. Please be concise, and then I'll invite the speakers to respond. So if you can put your hands up, and I'd also ask if you can just introduce yourselves as well at the beginning. Do we have wandering mics in the room at all?
Structure. Before the OU, there are 2 blocks in conflict, the Casablanca bloc and the Monrovia bloc. And at the OU meeting in Addis Ababa, Nkrumah and some others actually did not agree that they should just adopt the boundaries the way in which the OU adopted it. In 1997, Julius Nyerere, who was for the adoption of the boundaries, was in Ghana on the 40th anniversary of Ghana's independence, and pointed out that he saw that people like him were wrong. So he sat in a meeting. I didn't sit there. Julius Nyerere lived in 1997 to say that he was wrong. And the fact is that there are border wars in Africa as a result of that kind of arrangement. And so it is not me saying that there should be another way, but reality and practice have shown that there should be another way. And so that is what. So one can decide to bury their heads like ostriches in sand and say that they are not looking at the reality, but reality is important to be faced. With the situation in Congo, in fact, I thought that what I meant by the intervention and the Mutura meant that imperialists intervened in Congo. I didn't see it, and I see the issue of the Congo and all the other issues I referred to, not just as an issue of the people in the colonially created territories, but as issues of all Africans. And that I think that they shouldn't be just be seen as issues, isolated issues, but they are also a reflection of the general situation on the African continent. That is the context within which I see. And the fact that it is precisely because of this that some of us have taken the global initiative, for example, to organize education in such a way that the one we have within the establishment, there should be an alternative to it. I remember it is Katagi Woodson, the African American, who said that there are 2 ways of teaching: what somebody else has taught you and what you teach yourself. And he pointed out that what you teach yourself is a response to your own demand. But what somebody teaches you is used to serve that person's interest. The kind of narrative we've had over the years has been a narrative to serve the interest of the imperialism, to serve the interest of the intervention. And so we have to self-organize a different narrative which would inform the world differently and would inform younger people who might have been misled by the earlier narrative. That is what the way I see it. And also here, we as Africans who, even among Africans, there are those who just accept what has been given by the colonial order, the first form of teaching that Katagi Hussein refers to. So it is important that we have to build structures which will educate people differently. We have to also have structures like the Stop the War question and this campaign on Scramble for Africa, so that the people within Britain as well can be informed differently. In terms of resistance, I know there's not enough time, but I'll suggest one book, which I know is around. The African Awakening, the Emerging Revolutions, edited by Firoz Manki and Sokari Ekin. I've written a chapter in that. And that will give you a lot of information from country to country about what has been happening in Africa. I always tell people everywhere I go that there is nowhere where there's oppression and there is no resistance. And so I found it frequent that in many places they say there's no news about resistance in Africa. And the Africans are just as human as all people are in everywhere. So oppression means resistance. And the book, which it will be very easy to get anywhere, can help give a lot of details on what is happening in Africa from country to country.
Thank you. Very briefly, because Explo's dealt with most of the points. On the question on the OAU, Organisation of African Unity, and its acceptance of colonial boundaries, it's true they did, and that was, in a sense, quite a big retreat away from the principles of Pan-Africanism being promoted by particularly Kwame Nkrumah, but many others at the Chorlton-cum-Hardy conference in Britain in 1945 and subsequent conferences. But it's not really true that the OAU, or now African Union, have subscribed to that view. When you think that there's been a number of independence movements within African countries, such as South Sudan, Eritrea, you could almost argue Namibia was at one time Southwest Africa was administered fairly closely to South Africa, and then two countries were formed on the end of apartheid. And the current issue of the Western Sahara, which was a Spanish colony and was then, after a war, was occupied by Morocco, and the Western Sahara people, the Sahrawi people, are for the most part living in refugee camps in Algeria, as they have been since 1975. So there are enormous issues there which are unresolved by that, and they're probably going to get worse and could be a flashpoint for other things. The other point on Congo, thanks, fair point, I accept your point, absolutely on that. The oppression in the Congo is appalling, and the way in which the Western countries have armed and financed Rwanda in particular, and there is clearly a long-term agenda by a number of people to entice Eastern Congo towards East Africa by both economic and economic development through infrastructure projects, as well as mineral exploitation. And the losers in this are the women who suffer grievously in Eastern Congo, where rape is a weapon of war against the people there, and the militias, which are in reality funded by mineral companies somewhere along the line. And it's a horrible, horrible situation that's going on there. So we have to have some understanding of that. And the weird thing is, the world's media obviously report what's happening in the Middle East, fine, so they should. They report what's Afghanistan, Iraq, absolutely, I'm not complaining. But the death rate and the loss of life in the DRC is far greater than all of the other conflicts in the world put together. You're talking of the millions of people that have died either directly in the conflict or as a result of disruption and disease spread by that conflict. And it's largely unreported by the world's media. So we have to have that understanding and that solidarity. And also remember the colonial legacy. In every case, in every country where there's colonial masters, they have always practiced a promotion and demotion of particular linguistic groups, ethnic groups, national groups, in order to be able to better to control the place. And that legacy lives on in many, many other parts of Africa and is still being exploited by the West and by the Western economic interests.
Okay. We've got about 10 minutes before we need to wind up, so I'll take another couple of contributions from the floor. There's a lady right down here at the front, gentleman in the red in the middle, and that will be the last question, and then I'll ask both speakers.
To those points, Chinese companies are very involved in mineral exploitation in Africa. Usually it's accompanied by a degree of infrastructure investment, which sounds very generous and with great largesse, but in reality, building a railway line or a road that leads from a mine to a port could be construed as being mainly in the interest of getting the minerals out of the ground into the port, unless I've misunderstood the motive entirely, which is of course possible. And so I think one has to recognise that the Chinese companies might do it slightly differently, but there are huge issues about the training or lack of training of African workers to operate in those places, and the pricing that is paid, and also the huge degree of soft loans that are made to certain countries in return for purchasing of Chinese goods over the next X number of years, or the supply of minerals or oil at a fixed price. So for example, there was a massive $2 billion loan made to Angola in about 6 years ago, I think it was, maybe I might not be right on the exact date. The price paid by China for the oil from Angola remains unrevealed, and the amount of goods that have to be bought from China in return remains unrevealed. And so you have a relationship there that is extremely unclear to an awful lot of people, and that is repeated elsewhere across the continent. And I think that the political relationship is slightly different in the sense that China doesn't as overtly interfere in local politics as the way in which Americans or British traditionally have, but certainly the economic pull is enormous, so that when the Chinese Prime Minister invited African leaders to come to a conference in Beijing on future trade with Africa, I think I'm right in saying every single country attended, bar none. They wouldn't attend any other conference, bar none, anywhere in the world, even for the UN, I doubt. So that was a sign of just how powerful the Chinese purchasing is. The other point that was made about South Africa, yes, the Jamestown raid and what went with it, and Cecil Rhodes. But remember, that came actually, Rhodes and the establishment of Fort Salisbury, and he didn't just have a town and a university named after him, he had several countries named after himself as well. Rhodesia, both north and south. He was also a member of the British Parliament, so he wasn't the first or last corrupt person to be in the British Parliament. That came after the Congress of Berlin. That was 1884. Fort Salisbury was established from memory 1890. That was the founding of Rhodesia. And so the history is certainly there. My concluding thought is this. I'm really pleased we've got this quite short session on Africa today. I recommend you buy the book that Explo talked about, and also since you've all registered for Stop the War, I'll be able to get hold of email addresses that way, if I may, if you're happy about it. Circulate the information about the Liberation meeting we're holding on Africa on January the 14th. For those that wish to come, of course, will be most welcome to attend that, because we've got to recognise the new imperialism is about political control, is about mineral exploitation, is about land grabbing. It's not that different to exactly what happened during what was seen as the height of the colonial era in the late 19th through to the mid-20th century. My sorrow is that the joy of all those people that fought for and obtained independence in the 1950s and 1960s was largely destroyed on the altar of high oil prices, high interest rates, World Bank intervention and World Bank economic modelling, which has destroyed the economic independence of so much of Africa. And I think these are issues that we have to concentrate on, because they also lead to the military interventions.
Very strict to the the issue of China. Once there is economic control of any people, then automatically there's political impotence. And apart from what we've been talking about, another strange development in the case of China has been, in addition to the formal economic arrangements, they're coming in of illegal Chinese migrants and who do illegal mining. In fact, Ghana, in which I live, is one of the places, I think people might have seen it in the news, where people confronting even the illegal Chinese miners have been confronted with guns. Chinese have used guns to confront people in Ghana in particular, and it's been a great embarrassment even for the Chinese embassy in Ghana about this. I don't know whether that's repeated across other countries, but that's specific from our country. The issue of democracy, in fact, there is no form of democracy that can be introduced by other external forces to anybody. The fact that true democracy can only develop from within the people themselves. And one thing we want to point out is that Africans have also been fighting to ensure that they have control of their resources. They've been fighting through social movements and that. And just like during the anti-apartheid struggle, we had the anti-apartheid movement here. I think that groups like the Stop the War Coalition, other groups where we find a common way of working, fighting against common negative causes. We should be able to solidarize and have the movements which are standing for the interests of the people, but because of the support of the oppressive governments and the multinationals and all those other external forces here, they push the wrong guys in control. So we have to push the wrong guys out and from below get an alternative. And when that happens, then you will have the people's interest in Africa being advanced. And that is what groups like Kilombo and Don't Be Blind are involved in. We have a number of our people here, we have a number of our members here. After this session, you can approach any of us. I'm sure they can just show them by their hands. I don't have to call them Don't Be Blind and Kilombo. You see them, ESU. Jeremy has always been part of Kilombo. I'm happy he's here. And I'm sure the work that he's been doing with us, when I leave, he will do the same work with my colleagues who are here. We've not done much together of late, so Jeremy, I'm sure you'll be able to. And I'll say thank you all for being here, and thank you all for giving me company at this particular point in time. And this world cannot remain like this. It can change. Thank you.
Final words from me. As the two speakers have so eloquently said, and I'll use the phrase, another world is possible, but in order for that different world to be achieved, it needs the input of everybody who has, and I'll use the term, thirst for social justice. Because that's what it's about. It's about changing the world so every man, woman and child, the ordinary people who walk the streets of Britain, Africa, as an African I'm particularly concerned for Africa, enjoy the fruits of their labour, enjoy the fruits of the land. We've been told by Blair, Bush, Cameron, Obama, notice Conservatives and Labour, Republicans and Democrats, we're told this so much, this is the democracy, that there is a war on terror. I'd like us all to go away with a thought about what is terror. For me, war is terror. For those children in the Congo, the women in Liberia, Sierra Leone, people across the world who are terrorized and have been terrorized day in, day out by remote controlled drones, like people are sitting down playing PlayStations, by the West using puppets in Africa and different parts of the world to wage their wars. They know that war is terror. And again, if all of us in this room have that thirst for social justice, we won't just come to this conference here today and go away. What we will do is go away and think about the next step we can each take to make that other world possible. And thank you for listening.